Hello everyone, I'm Robin Cole, and today I'm so excited to take you with me as I explore one of these beautiful pink peonies. I had the bouquet just a couple of days ago, and those flowers have opened up and faded as I was painting them, so today we're going to work from a photo reference, and I'll tell you about some of the things I'm thinking through in terms of fundamentals, how the light is falling across the flower, dealing with the overwhelmingly saturated and beautiful color of these flowers, and some pigments I'm going to play around with, including a new one I've never tried on my palette. So let's get started. All right, give you a little tour quickly of what I have going here. I do like to wear a nitrile glove, at least on the hand that's holding my rag, because that's the one that would be in contact with solvent. I've got quite a variety of brushes here, a lot of flats that are kind of little stiffer, little rosemary ivory brushes. These are kind of the workhorses. I've got some rosemary evergreen, sort of a nice second layer brush. And I have a few soft blenders and a couple of sables. Pigment-wise, my normal palette, I have most of it on here. Titanium white, cadmium yellow, lemon, medium, and dark. This is Indian yellow. Right here normally would be yellow ochre, but I don't really need it in this piece. All the greens are pretty rich. This is cadmium orange, really good for modulating greens a little bit. Transparent red oxide from Rembrandt specifically. Cadmium red light and medium. This is quinacridone red, which I only sometimes use, but its tinting strength is kind of nice for rich reds like this. And we've got alizarin. This is quinacridone magenta, which I almost never use, actually. I'm kind of excited to play around with it. Just realized I have a broken palette knife. Let's try this one. Dioxazine purple, ultramarine blue, ivory black, viridian green, permanent green dark. And then this is a new one. This is Brilliant Pink from Holbein, although I think a few people make a pigment kind of like that. It seems really useful for this particular piece. And then just a little bit of cadmium green over here, just in case I need it for those brights where it's hard to kind of keep the warmth of the green as you're adding white, if you can't throw too much yellow in there. So that's what we're going to go with. We'll see where this takes us. Hopefully there's no crazy surprises waiting for me, but it's kind of fun to play around with a new pigment. And I'm just going to start off with this permanent green dark. We'll get to the painting in a second, but I'm going to use this to mix a kind of basic jumping off point green. I love this mixture, permanent green dark and transparent red oxide. Those two are just a match made in heaven for a sort of nice, dark, more natural feeling green. Of course, complementary colors will always help modulate each other. So I'm taking a red, in this case a warm dark red, and adding it to my cool dark green. So that kind of helped mellow it out a little bit, but let's try a little bit more. All right, so something around there looks really nice. And I'm just gonna kind of put that back up here, at least most of it. I guess I'll maybe keep part of it down here where it's useful. That's what I'm going to mix all of my greens from. I'm not going to probably use it at any point just as is, but it's a really nice base for greens. All right, so let's get going on the painting. So you'll see and hear me replacing the lid on my mineral spirits every single time I use them, which is kind of annoying, but really important. It's not good for you, that stuff. And I really like to cut down on exposure as much as I possibly can. All right, so looking at that reference photo, I love that flower. I'm not thrilled with that composition though. I cropped it out of a larger photo, but that was the bottom of the photograph. And it's just feeling like a little crowded down on the bottom there. So I think what I'm gonna do is just move that blossom up a tiny bit for ours. So we'll just go with a really, really simple drawing. We're mostly looking for size and placement at this stage. I want to kind of check these distances, simplify it down to some general angles. So I've increased this distance a little bit here, but I do still want it to have kind of the same size relationship to everything. Petals respond particularly well to what I call enveloping and drawing, which is kind of using an almost like connect the dots technique for the outside elements rather than following the contour of an individual petal. I'm going to sort of create a little space for them to inhabit and then place them in it, and it leads to significantly higher accuracy in drawing. Use a bit of siding, and I'm really trying to think of this as sort of maybe a sphere that's slightly squished, or like a cylinder that's slightly rounded, however it's easiest for you to think of it, but meaning this dimension is sort of like moving around a circle, and then this is a flat top, and that's really clearly reflected in the light and shadow situation with this flower. So I want to make sure that I maintain that because it's going to make my job a lot easier. So let's start off by throwing in some kind of guiding values. I like to paint with a kind of the largest brush that feels comfortable. This is maybe even still a little bit small, but I want to encourage myself to think in large shapes, not small ones. So let's see here. I'm gonna dip into that neomagilp a little bit because whatever I'm sort of using in the background, I'd like for it to set up pretty quickly so that I can paint on top of it without too much trouble. And what I really want to have in there, particularly because I'm painting on a white ground, is I just want to know how dark this is going to go, and pretty much everything looks dark next to white. So getting some of these values sort of placed early on is a good idea. Also, some of the little complicated bits in there, I don't know if it's worth getting into all of those shapes. It might just be a better idea to kind of cover them with some dark and sort of come back for whatever we need on an as needed basis. And then we got to make some decisions about the background. So you notice in the reference I had this wicker screen behind this part, and it was just the white wall behind the other part, which gives us that kind of lovely violet-y gray color. So like, do I want some of that dark in there? I don't know. It is kind of nice to have those rich tones. I certainly don't want to paint that line straight down just because it's in the reference. I think I'm gonna go for that background color a little bit kind of early on, which is not always the way that I would do things, but because this is a very mid-tony piece, I'm going to show you a black and white version of the reference. You'll notice that the greens and pinks are almost exactly the same value, and like these lighter tone, like there's sort of the mid-tones in here, are pretty darn close to the wall. So this isn't a strongly value-driven piece. It's pretty much color, but value is really what holds things together. So I need to take advantage of the value that is there and make sure that my painting feels like it kind of has some strong bones, and sort of weave the color in as we go. Because of that, I think I might go ahead and choose sort of a neutral gray and check out what the value is going to be for that background, and just put something in there so that I'm not trying to gauge those peony colors against white. So I'm going to be a true colorist here and go ahead and make that background color from, not with black, but from color. So I've got a little green, little violet. Let's throw some quinacridone in there, why not? Tint it up with some white. This will help ensure that all of our colors feel really related to each other, and that we don't just have this like random gray that has a different, I don't know, planet of origin than everything else. Mine ended up a little too violet-y. If it's a little too violet-y, we can always, of course, add some yellow, since that's the complement of violet. So that's really dark, but I think it's about in the right color family. Actually, that's looking a little rosy for me. I would really like for that to be a little more blue-green. In fact, I'm going to grab some Viridian, which is just such a nice cooling color without going straight to blue or black. That's looking nice, at least as a base. We could perhaps go a little lighter with it later. Now you'll notice it looks really dark on the white background, but if I compare it, if you look on the palette and you compare it to those darks we were throwing on there before, it's quite a bit lighter, and it's pretty similar to the wood of the palette here. So I may very well lighten this later. The impulse to lighten it right now is really strong. I know I get myself into trouble with that painting on white. I think I'm going to kind of creep it towards green a little bit, not everywhere, just kind of let it change a little as we go along. Because I like that relationship that those colors have in the reference. So every painting stroke is also a drawing opportunity, right? So as I'm doing this, I am looking carefully at those shapes that I just kind of threw in there sort of carelessly earlier. Not carelessly, but quickly. And taking some opportunities to correct them if they need it. All right, so that's most of our background. I have a feeling we're going to want to go more chromatic back there later, like maybe bring in a little more light and a little more kind of cool blue tones, either up there or down at the bottom. I haven't decided yet, but let's work on the flower a bit first. So I turned down the saturation just a tiny bit on the reference image because it's just, especially when you're looking at it on a screen, all of those colors look so saturated. It's really hard not to paint everything with, you know, reds straight out of the tube. But if I paint everything really, really saturated, like for example, right here, this is one of the peaks of saturation. But up here, if I'm only looking at this in the reference, it looks really saturated, but it can't really compete with this. So if I want this to stand out when I put it there, that means everything else has to be less saturated, which means I'm going to want to tone it down with something, probably the complement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix sort of like an average shadow color and an average light color. And as I'm looking at this, the light source, even though there's a lot of warmth in those petals because of the corally color, the light source itself feels relatively cool, which makes sort of the depths of those shadows feel relatively warm. I could definitely see a strong argument for sort of thinking of it in the opposite direction, with the light source being a little warmer and then pushing those shadows a little bit more towards violet. But because reds tend to go so cool when you add white to them, which we're certainly going to have to do right here, I might as well make it easy on myself and kind of treat the light as a little bit cooler, the shadow as a little bit warmer. So as I'm going to block in that shadow, now you can see why I didn't bother with all those petals, right? Because I'm just going to block it all in as one shape. So let's see, what are we going to have in the shadow mess? I'm just going to, I find when I'm painting with reds that I frequently just throw like all the reds together so that at least anything I do later on will feel related to all of them. So just threw a little bit of everything in there, and I'll let myself pick up some of this green to quiet that red down a little bit. And it definitely has a little bit of a corally quality in there, and value-wise, if I compare it to this, it's not as dark as those values. It's a little bit lighter. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of white in there. That's going to cool it way down, especially because I've got those cold reds in there. So let's see about maybe having some yellow involved. And remember, we're going to, this isn't, you know, the exact right color for every part of the shadow. This is an average that we're going to then paint into. It's not looking too bad. Still pretty saturated. So I find a violet to be kind of useful for modulating red sometimes. It's a little bit less confusing than adding blue. So when I look at that on the reference, again, it feels really, really rich, like a lot of cadmium red in there, but I want to leave myself room to go more saturated later. If I bottom it out now, I'm going to have no way to kind of take my painting to another level later on. So let's try some down here on this petal just so we can compare those two values. They are pretty darn close in that area down there, but I don't want this painting to get too dark. So I think I am gonna brighten it up just a little bit. You can lift it with yellow. Indian yellow is so great because it will warm something without really changing the value. It's like a magical pigment in that way. There we go. It's feeling better. So there is a lot of purple in that shadow down here. We'll maybe incorporate that into our first pass, but I'm gonna get a little bit of medium. I do not advocate painting with mineral spirits at all, but I'm adding like probably literally about a drop. I dipped like 2 bristles of my brush into it. And I just want a layer of paint that's thin enough that I can paint over it later easily without fighting it. When you get to confusing shapes, like right there, just squint. Right? Squint until they become simple. Paint the simple shapes. That's what your design depends on. Your design does not depend on frilly petal edges and details. All right, so there are a few other things in shadow. You saw me skip some stuff in there that are different enough that I'm going to depart from this average I've created here. So down here in this petal, there's just a real violet-y sensibility to that. So I'm going to grab some of that quinacridone magenta that I almost never use. Really pretty. It's just like a very, very cold leaning red. And let's add a little white so we can kind of get a sense of its true nature. That petal is kind of purpley enough that I might just go ahead and actually add some violet. I'm keeping it on my palette right next to my other red here because, so you see my first one here, second, third, and fourth, and I want to be able to see the relationships between those. I think of them as like siblings all descended from the same family, and when they're close together, you can really see the differences between them. So there is a bit of light in there, but just I'm going to make things easy on myself and just go ahead and group all that into the shadow. Don't worry about that light. I will come back for it later. I don't feel the need to go as saturated as I can go right now. That's sort of more of a later decision. In fact, I'm going to chill that out with a little bit of green. But I do just want to have a sense of some of that shift between these two petals. And maybe go a little bit lighter. The sort of striations on the petals where you see those white color changes that are just part of the flower, not really something I'm going to have time for in a painting of this length. So I'm just going to sort of do my best to play nicely with the ones that I can get to. But if you paint them too quickly without really paying attention, they can kind of just look like light rather than changing value. And I'm not sure we'll be able to get into all the nitty-gritty there. So looking at these other petals back here, there's another shadow value that's a little bit lighter and a little bit more orangey green. I'm going to kind of branch that off of this part. I'm going to dip into my cadmium orange. Orange can often look kind of greenish next to reds, which can be helpful sometimes. Throw a little bit of my green in there, but it's a very cold green, so it's kind of bluing it down a little bit too much. That is where that cadmium green, if the value isn't too light, can be super helpful. The cadmium green sort of operates as a cold yellow in some ways. So when I make a mark with this up there, it doesn't look like the value differentiates quite enough, but on my palette, you can see that it is, you know, it's different. It's a bit lighter. And I don't think I need to differentiate it more than that. If I do, it's gonna run the risk of not really sitting in the realm of shadow very well. This is definitely kind of uncomfortable with a brush this size, but I just make myself do it because it keeps my thinking on the right track in terms of large, simple decisions. And also every time you force yourself to paint something small with a large brush, it improves your brush dexterity. So these values right here are all kind of confusing, but if I squint, I do find that the light and shadow does differentiate. I'm going to go ahead and paint this one right here. Yes, I know those are different values, but again, this is the generalization stage. There are some other darker tones, like especially right here. The underside of this is a bit of a toss-up, but those more complex ones, I'm just gonna save them for a little while because midtones are just so incredibly difficult to gauge, especially when there's really saturated color involved, which can really masquerade as lightness of value, even though it's really just intensity of color. So I'm gonna leave that alone for now. Even though my palette is huge, I'm gonna clean it because I know I kind of favor this middle area. And now let's come up with an average for that light mass. Ignoring the white parts, ignoring the highlights, and ignoring like the darkest parts, like right here, we just want a nice average, like kind of the tone that's on this petal. And it's a very pinky red. Oops, that's not the red I want. Let's take that quinacridone red and some cad red medium. And ooh, let's maybe even try some of that fancy new pink. See what surprises await us. Probably it's a good idea to experiment with a new pigment first, not in a demo, but oh well. All right, so here's something, whoa, it's looking pretty exciting. I have not added anything to calm down the red yet. So I know that like my really saturated pieces can come all the way up to something like this. So that's great. I would like to neutralize it a little bit. So I'm gonna dip into some green. Let's maybe try some of that cadmium green, a little bit of our other greens. Because again, I do not wanna exhaust my saturation too early. And looking at the reference, what I'm after is I want the correct value relationship between the shadow average and the light average. That's going to help me make all other decisions. So this is a little lighter, but it's not nearly light enough. So let's pop some white in there. Of course, with the addition of titanium white, it's going to cool down. It's going to calm down, kind of desaturate, maybe even to a point where we start not feeling as excited about it. But we're after the value. So looking on my palette is a good measure of value. That's why I'm mixing it right next to the shadow tones. I want to make sure it's kind of sitting in the right value space. It's gotten a little too desaturated, so let's throw some of that pink back in there. I'm going to go just one tiny touch lighter. In fact, I'm going to siphon off half of that pile and just lighten the other half. Go a little lighter, a little pinker. All right, that's feeling nice. So again, I'm gonna wanna paint on top of this layer. I do like to have a little more paint in the light mask, but I don't want it to get like too gloppy to paint on in this short time frame. So I'm just gonna stick that light mask in there. And pink. Don't want to get too saturated, but I do want to press the value back down a little bit. Again, mixing it right next to the current one so I can see the difference. Yeah. Found a little drawing mistake. I'm gonna have to come back in with the shadow up there. Every painting stroke is a drawing stroke. You're always having an opportunity to correct. This is so cool down here. It really, that's a good opportunity for that magenta. There's a lot of complexities of light and shadow in play on this petal that I would love to just spend a few hours painting, but we might have to leave a couple of those behind for today's purposes. I think I am going to put in some of this dark right here. Can't really get around it. It's good to develop the confidence to move your brush in the direction you need. Like this stroke is going to go great in this direction, is going to go like not so great if I'm trying to do it this way. So these harsh transitions like this one here is really easy for me to blend that later. Come back in, I'll do it right now, and put in a little saturated moment of transition. I can whisk those all together, no problem. But it's really hard to create that structure later if you don't kind of paint your transitions and think about them individually. So this is going to look awfully geometric for quite some time, but it won't ultimately end up that way. All right, I'm going to get some new brushes here. I don't want to mix my pink and my green brushes together, and use these to kind of do a little bit of the same operation on the foliage. Not looking, very specifically not looking at leaves and parts and edges, but looking at shapes, most of which are pretty darn abstract. So I'm going to start with that little Linton rose there. It has a really interesting kind of golden, pinky gold green tone. It's kind of branch off of what we were just using a minute ago. Value-wise, it's almost the same as that, but it's definitely greener. Maybe something like in that category is feeling pretty good. Oh, this, although we took some shortcuts there, this is a more reliable value gauge, and it's a little bit lighter than that, so I gotta add some white to that. Maybe a little Indian yellow just to keep it warm. There we go. All right, I need a nice average green for some of my dark greens. Got that base, a little yellow. I want it to be rich, but again, not the peak of the saturation. I want it to differentiate from that underlying value. Ooh, now I do kind of wish I had yellow ochre, but I'm going to use some orange instead, which is probably a better idea to tie in those red tones. You'll find with these leaves that you just do not need to paint as many shapes as you might think. They're really, really forgiving, and a little implication gives a really pleasing result. A lot of reds there in the stem. So here, I'm looking in here, I'm keeping my eyes just sort of in soft focus, and I'm gonna not really paint exactly what I see. I'm gonna paint the feeling of what I see, which ultimately is like a little nicer to look at as a viewer, a little more experiential. There's some warm greens in there, and then there's definitely a couple of cool greens too, especially up there. So let's see. Throw in a pretty good amount of cadmium red into my green there to get up in here. Got a little too light. Darken it back down, warm it up with some Indian yellow. You'll notice this painting is really small. It's like 7 by 9, and I already used up my entire initial pile of that green, the little one that I had siphoned off, so I'm glad that I made more of it. But you want to try to set yourself up for success by not stopping to mix again and not trying to stretch tiny amounts of paint further than they should go. Like half of the battle with painting is just using enough paint, which is kind of hard to do sometimes, especially if you're in the zone. You don't want to stop and remix, and can deal with a lot of that by just mixing enough to begin with. I'm going to get into that Viridian just a little. I'm not like loving the way that these greens look against that background color, so I have a feeling there might be some changes in its future. There's a lot of red tones in almost all of the stems. I'm gonna actually maybe get into my alizarin a little bit just to keep that dark value. And let's see about some of these shapes. So I like to use other brushes usually to use the stems, but sometimes the flat is already in my hand and I just can't resist. So sometimes a bad decision, sometimes a good decision. I do like to let little flickers of the main colors kind of get into the atmosphere. It helps things feel like they belong. All right, I'm gonna start a new green thread up here. See if we can get into some of the light masses of those leaves. They're pretty darn chromatic, but still kind of cool in nature. Can already feel this helping a little bit with the light being convincingly unified in where it's coming from. Those warm and cool greens do nicely next to each other. Really not much light in there. I'm going to kind of leave that in a pool of shadow. I'm going to push this lighter and bluer with some Viridian. We've got those really yellowy little shoots. It helps to have some really blue greens so that these guys feel like really yellow greens. Probably not going to have time to get into the details of those as much as I like them. But let's get some color notes in here for them. It's really, it's not even the plant, it's just like the feeling of that little spark of green kind of cascading across the top there. That's so helpful. These greens are a little darker than the flower. Really, you notice I'm wiping my brush between like every single stroke. I'm really trying to keep these clean and kind of divided. All right, I am going to take a moment to add now some of those lighter spots on the flower. Just because I want to get them into that same kind of value range. This should not be outshining that, and currently it really is. And I can't tell if it's because that's too light, which it might be. It's really bright on the palette. But let's get some of those lights in there, and then we'll start really, I want to do a couple of things before we start really dealing with the light and shadow and the different colors in there. So I'm going to take my same light mask tone as a jumping off point and add a bunch of white. The white is going to cool it way down in a not very exciting way, so it's often a good idea, even though our light is kind of cool, to add a bit of the yellow in there. And we got to think about this in two ways, right? Because some of that light is coming from the color of the petal and some of it is coming from the actual light. So I would like to deal with the actual light first. Put some of that brilliant pink in there, and then we can deal with the striations on top of that. So I'm thinking of a sphere and imagining, you know, this is just a ball. The light is sort of centering right here. This is where the highlight is. The lighter midtones are going to drop off from there and then wrap around to the shadow. We can't really see like the core shadow because of our angle here, but we can definitely see the light mass. We can definitely see the shadow mass. And they definitely deserve to be dealt with a little bit differently. So again, I know that it's a really blendy kind of gradient in here, but I'm going to keep it as structural as I can for as long as I can because it's really easy to blend it later. It is hard to find structure later. There's that other little petal in there that I kind of skipped. Picked up some of the dark and it mixed into a cool tone there, so I'll come back and fix that later. See if we can't separate these petals a tiny bit. I'm focusing like 75% on value, 25% on color right now, because no sense in wasting time on the color if the value is not in the right category. So like that lighter part right there, that's a different local value, but it's like a lot more pinky purpley than what I'm dealing with right now. So I think I'll treat it separately. Yeah. Quinacridone magenta is a useful color as it turns out. You see that anywhere else? I think I do see it. Maybe a little bit in here. You see how the color that looked so bright here? This is exactly the same thing on my brush, a little bit further into the light mass. That's simultaneous contrast, right? And that's part of what's always kind of haunting us in terms of visual illusion, optical illusions rather. So we got to keep that in mind. There's another sort of similar moment of that. A little bit further back here. So I'm going to start working into that shadow tone, but I want to think, I don't want to depart, cool that down with some Viridian. I don't want to depart too much from like the shadow family that I have put this in value-wise. Otherwise that light effect is going to fall apart a little bit. And right now it's quite strong. It's strong enough that I might have to, just as I have upped the light away from our average here, I might have to dip some of these darker tones away from our average. So I'll give you a little bit of a sense of that. That definitely gets into some kind of reddish tones. Or maybe it's just more of an orangey version of that quinacridone. And I'm still in my light family over here, so I'm looking at it next to my original light mask color and making sure it's a little bit darker, but it's not as dark as my shadow tones, or else again it's going to throw off the illusion of structure. Not too bad, it's a little orangey, but I think I'm good with it. And if I'm wiping into another area to blend it, I gotta be sure to wipe my brush in between. couple of that going on down here. And let's get into some of our really true saturation. Starting to lift. Might even be a tiny bit much for that area. Put it a few other places and see how it does. I'm going to be careful with saturation. The second you start, think that it's pretty and start putting it everywhere, it kind of loses its power. So. All right, so the structure is pretty much there. I think I'd like to revisit the background a little bit, and then I'm going to do something kind of crazy that I love to do that sometimes goes well and sometimes goes really horribly badly. I'd like a little more, just that gray is not doing it for me. It's too neutral. And I either want a little bit more like minty green, or actually maybe a little more violet. I'm going to go into the dioxazine. Not bad. Maybe a little dioxazine and a little viridian. Now we got to brighten it up again. Just a little something to kind of mix it up, at least in this upper quadrant. And I don't want to lose my opportunity later to come in and kind of carve out some of these shapes. But this is kind of contributing to that feeling of cool light, which is nice. Having a pretty easy time layering on top of the background because it's thin and it's kind of set up a little bit from that medium. And I'm really not at all invested in making this into like an even gradient in the background. I want it to feel like it has a little bit of life in it, like breathe a little. So in an effort to integrate the background a little and kind of spread our subject's colors around in there, because right now it feels like a backdrop, like a theater backdrop with a flower in front of it. And I'm not at all interested in that. I want like a flower in a dynamic space. So this really cool thing. It's like a squeegee brush. And it is utterly unpredictable, which is good and bad. So let's see what happens if we just, so that little deposit of green over there, that's part of what I was after. It's always like a bit of a question, which way do we want to drag this? So, yep, it's going to kind of screw up some of our edges, screw up some of our shapes, but, because I let the shapes be pretty strong underneath, it can hold up to a bit of manipulation like this. The other thing this is going to do is soften a lot of my edges. You can already see how that has taken over as the sharpest edge because a lot of other stuff has quieted down, and that is a good thing. If all the edges are sharp, then none of them are sharp. This is a good time to kind of get some fun texture. If you can maybe like get a few, see how well that one mark even kind of helps the flower to sort of feel like it belongs in that space, like there's maybe some light and color bouncing around. But this is a good time to throw a couple pieces of that in there. And while it's still nice and wet, I'm going to now finally kind of blend in some of those transitions that I had painted really individually. So I'm just barely touching the surface of this. And you see how effortlessly that will just kind of snap into roundness if you've set those transitions up well. If there's not strong shapes under that, this just kind of turns into blurry goo, what we're doing right now. And then after this, I'm going to leave this thing alone for a little while and come back to it because I made a bunch of major decisions and I want to kind of let them sit in my consciousness for a bit before I do anything ill-advised. This is the time of day in my studio when all the values seem to invert and I find myself kind of chasing the light. Oh my goodness, look what happened to the video. So I'll take a break and come back the next time as the light is creeping across my canvas here. See if I can change the video so you can see what's happening with the sun. This is not a good situation for painting. It leads to terrible choices. So I'm going to stop it for now, come back later. All right, the sun is on the other side of the building now, and I have cleaned my palette. So let's see where we can go from here. Made a couple of decisions while I was away. One is I think I'd like to go a little bit more chromatic in the background. Just get my brushes back out of the oil where they were sitting here. And I need to go darker in the darks. So the darker darks are going to be probably the kind of biggest change. So I think I ought to do that first. And I might also just use a bit of plain linseed oil to kind of help me float some of those darks on top of that. All right, now that the light is a little bit easier to see, it's quite easy for me to tell, realizing that there's some artifacts of the photograph that I might not necessarily want, but definitely this area is darker. There's a little bit more richness in the shadow back there, and I think especially this kind of mid-tony area, this part might be okay value-wise, although the color needs to change a little. This all needs to be pushed back a bit. So I'm out of that kind of basic shadow mixture that I had been using, but let's start out with the darkness of alizarin. We'll kind of get all of our reds in there like we talked about before. Ooh, a little too much cadmium. We will tone it down with some green. And then we'll kind of branch off of that. That's going to be quite a bit too dark and too warm, but we can start kind of bringing it over. So this is sort of a revisitation of where we were at in the beginning of the painting, just with a little more information now. So that's the kind of getting to the right value range, but it's a bit too red. Maybe stick a tiny bit of white in there, help cool it down along with that quinacridone magenta. Magenta. And pushing things down into that range seems like a good idea to me. And I don't think I want it to be quite so geometric anymore, so I am going to switch to a little bit softer brush, a little softer, and a filbert. I don't want to kind of paint out all of that freshness that we worked so hard for in the last session. So I'm going to try to still keep my strokes feeling a little spontaneous. Trying to kind of push everything in this shadow area into a slightly more chromatic category. It's a little bit brown from those earlier decisions. It's not working real well for me. I like a few of those really saturated pink notes, but we need more of them so that that one isn't quite so lonely. I like what this brush is doing. It's kind of sticking just enough to the existing layer, but also floating on top of it a little bit. This is one of the Rosemary Evergreen brushes. Perfect behavior from a second layer brush. And I think that the light could actually stand to go even a little bit lighter. I'm going to use some of that quinacridone magenta for that sort of violety light right there. Oh, that's a nice color. I feel like I'm having a few too many like kind of purely yellowy tones in the light. A little bit more of this pinky bluey business is gonna benefit my painting. All right, so now that we've gotten that kind of shifted a little bit and brought the color up a little bit, although just one more spot. It's always the way, just one more spot, right? Sometimes I always say right before we're about to make a terrible decision. Well, not the best decision, but not the worst either. So I think I'd like to do a little bit of similar decision making in those greens, especially because I kind of squashed them around yesterday and I lost. They have a little more spontaneity and expressiveness now, but they've lost a bit of the structure. So I'm going to go back to that kind of parent green that I had set up. Get some real darks in there, maybe a little alizarin, keep it kind of warm. Some cadmium, or maybe just that quinacridone red would be the most expedient. So it's like, it's not quite a black, but it's pretty dark what I've got here. So I made another big decision while I wasn't painting on this, which is that I'm going to shift the color of the background a little bit. I know I did that before, it's still kind of a little grayish for me. So I'm going to change it. It feels like a nice choice. It just seems like it kind of has a little bit more of a conversation with the flower, which makes sense because it's got the flower's colors in it, helping to form this color, right? And I can use this as an opportunity to kind of continue carving out those shapes in a really fun way. I don't want it to be blotchy, but I do want it to be expressive. And I think as it comes down and kind of heads into this color, what I'm going to do is mix it right into my flower color here and see if I can't get something interesting looking going that starts to incorporate more of those reds. Because I just felt like I was really missing the dialogue of like the flowers in the background. And I think that this might help quite a bit with that. In fact, what if we just make like almost a little bit of a bleed right from the flower into the atmosphere? I'm trying to make not enough paint do something that it won't do. Never a good choice. Yeah, I think that that creates a much nicer spatial relationship. So I'm gonna just sort of leave things going in that direction. And just to kind of help tie it in, of course, we might need to have a few pieces of that same thought in a few other areas, like maybe over there. And if you get too many kind of similar looking brush strokes, the palette knife is a great tool to get in there and just kind of add a little spontaneity. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it screws up the nice freshness you had before, but we can only do our best. Let's see if we can't get a little piece of green in there somewhere. There we go. If you're doing this, you just want to make sure that they don't end up in like blurry little clouds, because then it just becomes mud, just colors without shapes, and that's not particularly helpful. So let's just throw in a few final details here and we will call it good. I think I might just, even though they're not in the reference, I'm going to pull out a few, oh, that might have been a little overboard, a few more little light shapes in the middle there. Just kind of feels like it needs a couple. And I think that'll just about do it. So I hope that you have enjoyed exploring these as much as I do. Always so many challenges to work through, but you can always change your mind. That's the amazing thing about oil paint. Worst thing that will ever happen is that you let it dry and paint it again. So we'll see you next time.